Hi, I'm Giulio Bocaletti. Good morning, good afternoon. I am the author of the book Water, a Biography. I'm also the scientific director of the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, the principal research center on climate in Italy. And it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with you today, albeit virtually. I'm sorry I can't be with you in Santa Marta in person today. Hopefully I'll make it there next year for the 500th anniversary of the oldest town in Colombia. Also, thank you to the Summit Tras La Perla for inviting me to give you some remarks about water. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I know it's hard to watch a video of somebody speaking, but I just wanted to share a few thoughts about the importance of water and of what you're going to talk about today. And to open, let me just say that I think it's no mystery that something is going on. We've seen water crises all across the world. I'm actually from Italy, and right now the country is going through a rather dramatic drought, particularly in the south of Italy, in Sicily and Sicily, and in various parts of the southern part of the country. But this has been repeated in Greece, where you might have seen in the news there's profound droughts that have led to very dangerous and extensive fires. But those droughts have been happening in other parts of the world, as we've had also floods, catastrophic floods across the world. Again, in my own country of Italy, we've had a catastrophic flood only 2 years ago that did a lot of damage. So something is happening in the world, and people are struggling to receive the water services that they've come to expect. And often I think people conclude that what's happening is that the climate system is changing, and that's the dominant story, that when it rains or when you have droughts has changed, and therefore you don't have water when you used to. But that's not the whole story, actually. What we're witnessing today, what we're witnessing around the world, and what I suspect you're also seeing in Colombia, which is a country with enormous water resources, is not so much a failure of nature, but a failure of infrastructure and institutions. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today, is the role of water as infrastructure, as institutions, as a symptom of the capacity of the state and of communities to deliver on the promise of life together in the landscape. And let me just make three basic points. The first point I want to make to you is that water matters to our relationship to the landscape in a very, very profound and visceral way. When I started writing the book, I began digging for stories of our relationship with water. And I found this story, which I'm sure you've heard. It is a story of a great old man who is spoken to by a god, and the god tells him to build a big boat because a great flood will come and will cover the earth. And so he should save himself and his family. And so the man, a patriarch, goes off and builds this big boat, and we have descriptions of the boat. It's a big round vessel. It's 10 stories high. It has 6 decks. It has a roof. And the person builds this boat, puts all of his animals on the boat, seeds his family, and sets off to sea. And then finally the rains come. The famous cataracts flood from the sky and cover the world in water, as the gods had predicted. And he floats for days and days and days and nights and nights and nights until the whole world is covered and everybody else has drowned. Eventually the rains stop. He sends a bird out in search for land, but the bird comes back. He has found none. He sends a second bird out, a dove. The dove comes back, and it has found no land. And then a third time, the man sends out a bird, and the bird doesn't come back. Land has re-emerged. The boat lands on a mountain called Mount Urartu. The floodwaters drain away, and life begins again. Now, this story, which some of you will have heard if you belong to the Christian or Abrahamic tradition, Jewish or Islamic tradition, you will recognize this as the story of Noah's Ark from Genesis. But actually it isn't. It isn't the story of Noah's Ark, or it isn't only the story of Noah's Ark. The story in question is actually much, much older. Genesis is a book of the 6th century BC, but this story dates back to 1800 BC, and probably too much earlier. And it's the story that comes from an epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh was written in Mesopotamia around the time of the city of Uruk. It's the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who goes out to find a patriarch called Utnapishtim, who is in fact the character of the story. Now, this is an ancient story, and what I discovered in writing my book, there's these kinds of stories actually everywhere on the planet, not just in Mesopotamia, not just in the biblical tradition of Noah's Ark, but you find it anywhere. I lived in New York City, for example, in Manhattan for a number of years, and Manhattan is called Mannahatta because the indigenous people of Manhattan, before the Dutch came, the Lenape tribes called it that, and the Lenape believed they were the descendants of insect people that had survived a great flood, and they'd saved themselves by following a bird and flying out into the sky. Or in Peru, for example, the survivors of Cuzco, when Cristobal de Molina recorded the stories of the survivors of Cuzco, he recorded the story of the Unupachacuti flood, a great flood that covered the land, and two brothers that had saved themselves going up on a mountain. You find the same story in the north of Europe, in Norway, in the Viking sagas. There's the great frost giant Bergelmir, who at the time of a great flood builds a boat made of ice, because of course he's from Norway, puts his wife and family on it and floats away, surviving a great flood. You find the same story in China. In China, the story of the Jade Emperor, who turned 4 great dragons into mountains, and the mountains then turned themselves into rivers that flooded the plains, creating the productive landscape of China. Or you find that even in the Aboriginal tribes of Australia, which were separated for tens of thousands of years from the Asian continent, and yet in their stories, in their song lines, their oral tradition, we find evidence of a time when the land was covered by water and then the lands receded again. So everywhere you look in human history, in every society, water is at the heart of the origin story. It's at the heart of the start of society. And this is not the symptom of some uniform geological event. It's not true that all societies experienced some flood at the same time. What this means is that all societies experience water as such a profound element of their origin story that all of them develop these kinds of stories. And indeed, ever since we became sedentary some 10,000 years ago, all human societies, pretty much all human societies, have had to deal with this fundamental problem of standing still in a place like Santa Marta or London or Palermo in Sicily, standing still in a world of water that moves around us. Right? And so this is the first point I wanted to make to you, that when you talk about water, you might get lost in discussions about treatment works and pipes and infrastructure. But in reality, the story of water is the most profound story of humanity. It's the story that links us to our environment. The second point that I want to make to you is that profound story is fundamentally political. It's fundamentally political. When you're thinking about water, you're not really thinking about economics as much as you're thinking about politics, about exercising sovereignty over the landscape, about who decides what it looks like when you look out of the window in the morning, right? That's really what we're talking about, is who gets to make decisions about the nature of your landscape. And it's profoundly political. And the way we know this is, I'll give you another example. I'll jump forward in time. You know that democracy is really born in Athens in the 5th century BCE, and it's the product of those famous reforms, the reforms that Solon first and then Cleisthenes implemented to give rights, to give power to citizens. Right? And we can't imagine Athens being a modern democracy. Of course, they had slavery. I mean, this is a different place, right? But it is the place that has the the kind of beginnings of our democratic projects. Well, why did it happen? Well, what happened in Athens was that the hoplites, which were the heavy armored infantrymen that protected the polis, the city, demanded political power, right? They were the military men that saved the polis during the Persian and Peloponnesian wars that Thucydides and Herodotus described. And so because they were militarily powerful, they wanted political power. And so that's why the reforms happened. Solon and Cleisthenes gave political power to the defenders of the polis. But why were they militarily powerful? Well, they were militarily powerful because they were farmers. They were farmers who produced enough food not only to feed themselves, but to enrich themselves. And so they could buy the heavy armor and the heavy weapons that were necessary to be powerful hoplites. So they were politically powerful because they were militarily powerful, and they were militarily powerful because they were economically powerful, because they were farmers, rich farmers. But why were they rich farmers? Well, it turns out that Attica, the region in which Athens is well irrigated by rains, benign rains that keep the landscape irrigated and plentiful. And in fact, you can pretty much map the production in Attica at the time onto rainfall patterns. Right? And so it turns out that the political power that gets distributed by democratic reforms lands on those who are militarily powerful in Athens, who are economically powerful. They're rich, and they're rich because they're rich farmers, and they're rich farmers because they benefit from the distribution of water that nature has provided. I'm not saying that democracy is born out of water. I'm not saying that the distribution of rain distributed power. It's not a cause and effect story, but there is no question that in the construction of political power, our relationship with water on the landscape is a dialectic one, right? It's a relationship that influences the structure of the institutions that we live in particular, the political institutions. So that's the second reason why it's so important to talk about water. It's not just a fundamental root of our relationship to the landscape, it's also the political ingredient, it's the political substance that links us to that landscape. And then the third and last point I want to make is that water is, in modernity, about infrastructure and institutions and their failure. The great promise of the 20th century was to emancipate us from the variability of nature. The life of somebody living in Santa Marta or living in Italy in 1900 was basically indistinguishable from the life of somebody living there in 1200. You were basically exposed to the climate system, to weather. If it rains, there's water. If it doesn't rain, there isn't. If there's a drought, you don't have food. If there's too much water, you get flooded. And then over the course of a generation between the 1900s and 1970, 1980, we transformed the landscape of most countries. We built infrastructure, we built canals, we built dams, we built infrastructure to convert the natural hydrology of the planet, of our landscapes, the wealth of water that a place like Colombia has, the hydrology of nature. We converted that into hydraulics functional to modernity, functional to industrialization and to a modern economy. And that's the reason why most people don't wade a river on the way to work, and most people hope to open a tap in their kitchen to get water instead of going to the river with a bucket. Right? That was the promise of modernity, and it's a promise that's built on the capacity of the state to deliver, on the capacity of local, regional and central governments to deliver on that promise of modernity. And what's happening all across the world, I'm sure in Colombia, but also in Italy, in the UK, all across Europe, and even in the United States, is that promise is breaking. That over the years, the capacity of public institutions to deliver on that promise has been eroded. And it's been eroded in part because the climate system is changing, the statistics of precipitation are changing, but it's been eroded also because we're not resourcing the infrastructure and institutions that manage water as we used to. We've all forgotten that it matters. It used to be the case that most people lived in agriculture and lived off of agriculture, and water was a very present issue for them. But modernity means that most people look at their screen, live a life in a city and don't actually realize even where their water comes from. And that is really the last thought I want to leave you with as you talk about water in your summit, that really what we have to rediscover now are those three things. One, that water matters. It's a fundamental root of our living together in society. Two, that it's eminently political, that in the end, it's about power. It's about who decides what happens on the landscape. And three, that a modern life requires infrastructure and institutions as the fundamental platform for development. Right? If we don't have control of our water resources, if we can't design together the landscape that we want to live in, then we'd have no basis for broader economic development. Well, there's one thing that we learned in the 20th century is that the control of water resources, the management of water, and the delivery of water services is a fundamental basis. It's a fundamental platform for economic development. Without it, economic development cannot happen. Now in the 21st century, we know a lot more than we did in the 20th century. So we know that infrastructure is not just about building dams or canals. It's also about learning how to use ecosystems and forests and wetlands, right? So it's a much more complex, sophisticated way of confronting the landscape. But the recipe is always the same. At the end of the day, managing water is about a civic pact. It's about the state, local, regional, central, and the citizens coming together to govern in a place the water resources that they have to build the future they want. Right? That's really what the conversation about water is about. And so with that, I wish you great discussions over the course of your summit. I can't think of anything more important to do. And I really look forward to hopefully seeing you in person next year. Thank you very much.